In this episode of the Rescue Mission podcast, we are focusing on the second in a series covering the 5 waves of the rescue mission and city mission movement. Welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today, well, it's about moving past those really early, kind of wide-ranging experiments of Wave 1, the city mission societies, and figuring out how a successful, repeatable model, Wave 2, actually got engineered. Last time, we looked at the societies, and they were trying, well, pretty much everything to tackle the huge social problems popping up with cities growing so fast. It felt like chaos, but maybe necessary chaos.
That's a really good way to put it. Wave 1, the societies, they were marked by this incredible range of services. I mean, everything from soup kitchens, job training, even savings banks, temperance groups, big educational programs. A lot of those early ambitious efforts, while, really noble, they eventually got replaced or kind of absorbed by the modern welfare state as government slowly started stepping into those roles. Okay,
so Wave 2, these sustainable city missions, it's not about doing more stuff necessarily. It's more about focus, like shifting from a scattergun approach to really aiming for the bullseye. We're looking at a much smaller set of core programs that proved they could work, they could scale up, and they could last long term. And these programs really focused around evangelism, practical help for the homeless, and addiction recovery.
Right. And to really understand this shift, from that broad experimentation to something replicable and successful, we're going to use a specific lens. It's Everett Diffusion of innovations theory. It's a useful framework because it helps us look past just the amazing human stories, which are obviously inspiring, and get into the nuts and bolts of how that initial creativity turned into movements that could actually spread and last, across different places and over generations.
Like an engineering manual for social change, almost. It kind of shows us that lasting power isn't just luck. The sources we're looking at make it clear that even though these 2 waves, the sprawling societies and the focused missions, popped up around the same time, making that distinction is really important because the vision and the mission of the city mission model that lasted, it was fundamentally different. It went from general charity to something more targeted, more strategic.
Precisely. Wave 1 was asking, what can we possibly do to help? Wave 2 answered, okay, what actually works consistently? How do we fund it reliably? And what's the core mission we absolutely have to stick to? That change in focus? Well, it changed everything.
So when we talk about the foundation of what worked and what lasted in this whole movement, we really have to start with the founder, right? David Nasmith. He's widely seen as the guy who set up the lasting model for the city mission.
Absolutely. And there's this almost poignant irony in his story. Nasmith really, really wanted to be a foreign missionary. His heart was set on going to the South Seas or maybe Africa. He spent years applying, but he kept getting rejected. And the main reason, he didn't have a formal university education. He came from a working class background, largely self-taught. That rejection, that closed door from the established church and mission groups, that's what ended up redirecting all his incredible energy towards the problems right there at home in Scotland.
Wow. So that redirected energy hits this perfect storm moment in the early 1800s. Can you paint a picture of Glasgow back then? Because it wasn't just about poverty. It sounds like society itself was completely upheaved.
Oh, it was transformative and honestly pretty devastating. The Industrial Revolution basically turned Glasgow into a major city almost overnight. The population just exploded. And that led to this intense, uncontrolled growth. Think about the tenements, these dark, damp, incredibly packed housing blocks, hardly any sanitation. Poverty was just grinding people down. Crime was rampant. And the established churches, often they were located downtown, but they just weren't connecting with these new, huge, often shifting working class communities. A massive chunk of the city felt spiritually adrift, just neglected.
That sounds like the definition of a crisis needing a totally new way of thinking. And into this mess steps a 27-year-old Nasmith who'd already gotten some experience with youth groups and Bible societies.
Exactly. In January 1826, Nasmith founded the Glasgow City Mission, and that's rightly seen as the world's first city mission. This wasn't just tweaking an existing church program, it was a whole new structure, built on this idea the sources describe as acting by every means in their power. He saw that the old ways, the local parish structure, relying on volunteers, just couldn't cope with the scale of these new urban problems.
And his solution basically became the template for this second wave. The sources break his approach down into 5 key innovations. Let's maybe dig into these because they really feel like the DNA of the whole movement.
Okay. The first one, and maybe the most radical structurally, was interdenominationalism. Before Nasmith, most charity work was tied strictly to one church or one denomination, led by their own ordained ministers. That often led to, well, inefficiency, arguments over territory, and just limited resources. Nasmith created what we now call the parachurch space, an organization that existed alongside the churches but demanded that Christians from different backgrounds, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, whatever, work together, share money, share purpose.
Hang on, that sounds incredibly difficult logistically. I mean, getting different denominations to cooperate is tough now. Back then, weren't there huge theological barriers, turf wars, getting 30 different ministers and churches to pool resources and agree on a central plan? That sounds like a management nightmare.
Oh, absolutely. It must have been a massive headache. But Nasmith saw it as the only way to get the scale needed for a city like Glasgow. His innovation was building cooperation into the structure itself, creating a formal setup, a board, that basically forced collaboration for the bigger goal of reaching the city. This central shared leadership model, what they first called the society, before it evolved into the mission, was really unheard of.
Okay, that sets the stage structurally. The second and third innovations seem to focus more on what they were actually doing.
Exactly. Second was this commitment to holistic ministry, caring for the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. It wasn't just about spiritual conversion. It was about tackling the crippling effects of poverty, lack of education, disease. And that commitment naturally flowed into the third innovation, the dual focus. The mission deliberately balanced evangelism and practical help equally. It was this idea of, no cold-hearted evangelism and no Christless social work, making sure both needs were addressed together.
And the fourth innovation, that ties right back to Nasmith's own story, his own rejection, which is such a powerful element here.
It really is, and it's maybe the defining feature of Wave 2, lay leadership. Nasmith specifically required the use of paid full-time workers agents, they called them, who did not need to be ordained or have a formal university degree. Because Nasmith himself got shut out due to his working-class background and lack of formal schooling, he deliberately removed that exact barrier for the people who worked for the mission.
The genius there seems to be that what started as maybe a structural necessity, because of who we could hire, actually turned into a huge relational advantage, which I guess ties into our later analysis about how things spread.
Precisely. Because these leaders were often hired from the working class themselves, they had what sociologists call high homophily, basically cultural similarity. They shared a background with the people they were trying to serve in those tenements. Think about it. If you're trying to reach people the established church sees as spiritually adrift, the person knocking on your door who looks like you, talks like you, understands your daily grind, well, they're going to be way more effective than maybe a well-meaning but educated, wealthier volunteer from the parish church.
Yeah, that makes the whole model feel much more grounded and relatable.
Okay.
And the fifth innovation,
a clear, unwavering focus on the marginalized. Nasmith was specifically targeting the poor, the unchurched, people in prisons, basically, the folks the established church was often overlooking or, let's be honest, maybe even judging.
Right.
And it's important to connect Nasmith's work to the bigger picture. The missiologist Ralph Winter, he pointed out something interesting. He argued that the Protestant Reformation, while it was vital for correcting abuses, it kind of unintentionally suppressed or got rid of those mission-focused societies, the parachurch groups that had existed before. Nasmith, by creating this interdenominational focused structure for city missions, essentially reinvented that lost way of doing mission-focused collective charity. He was kind of correcting a structural gap that had existed for centuries.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From the founder's vision to the mechanics of how this actually spread, now we bring in that analytical tool, Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovations theory. We're using a business sociology framework on a spiritual movement, but the sources argue this is exactly how we uncover principles that can be repeated.
That's the idea. We're looking at the mechanics of past success so we can maybe inform future innovation. Think of it like studying aviation history. You don't just admire the Wright brothers, right? You study the aerodynamics, the materials, the engineering that made their design workable and replicable. We're not trying to downplay the spiritual element in Nasmith's work at all, but we are analyzing the human systems he designed that allowed that spiritual energy to spread effectively.
Yeah, it's like understanding how the human body works doesn't take away the miracle of life. Analyzing how a spiritual movement spread historically doesn't negate God's work in it. It just helps us see the blueprint.
Exactly. And a really key part of Rogers' theory is the innovation adoption life cycle. It basically maps out how people adopt new ideas at different rates. You've got the innovators, then the early adopters, the early majority, late majority, and finally the laggards. Most people fall into those majority categories. They're cautious, they want to see proof first.
And that life cycle map leads us right to maybe the biggest hurdle for any new idea, what Geoffrey Moore famously called the chasm. Can you explain what that is and why it's such a big deal?
Yeah, the chasm. It's that critical, often fatal gap between the initial excitement of the innovators and early adopters, the people who jump on board because an idea is new and cool, and the much larger, more cautious mainstream market, the early majority. Innovators are visionaries. The early majority needs practical results, reliable support, stability. Most great ideas actually die right there in the chasm because the very things that made the idea successful with the early adopters aren't usually what's needed to win over the mainstream. The organization often isn't ready for that jump.
Okay, so applying this to our story, David Nasmith himself, he was the absolute master of that early adopter stage. He took the vision others had and turned it into the tactical model.
Exactly right. Nasmith didn't invent the idea of urban ministry. Guys like Thomas Chalmers, Greville Ewing, they'd already laid the theological groundwork for why it was needed. But Nasmith was the one who translated that big picture vision into the practical, replicable blueprint, the city mission. He solved the key replication problem that held back earlier attempts.
And what was that specific replication problem he solved?
Well, Chalmers' model, brilliant as it was in theory, it was totally dependent on the local parish structure and on, frankly, inconsistent volunteers from just one church. It could be amazing when it worked, but it relied heavily on having really gifted local leaders and committed volunteers, which is hard to duplicate everywhere. Nasmith saw that limitation. His big adaptation was twofold. First, he shifted to using paid, full-time lay agents, reliable workers, instead of unpredictable volunteers. Second, he made the missions interdenominational, which broke free from the limits of just one parish's boundaries or resources. That adaptation made the whole concept much more adoptable in different cities, even different countries.
So he wasn't just a founder. He became this, whirlwind diffuser of the idea, traveling constantly for 13 years before he died so young at 40, and founding almost 60 city missions. That pace is incredible. Scotland, England, Ireland, the U.S., Canada, even France.
It was an absolutely relentless pace, and sadly, probably unsustainable for him personally. The sources do suggest that by spreading himself so incredibly thin, trying to be the visionary, the recruiter, the fundraiser, the main traveling promoter, all at once, he likely contributed to his own early death. And the result was predictable, unfortunately. Most of the missions he personally started, especially those 16 in the U.S., they just didn't have the established long-term local leadership needed to survive when he suddenly wasn't there anymore. Many of them collapsed pretty soon after he died.
That's really tragic, dying young, leaving his wife and 5 kids in poverty, although thankfully his followers did eventually rally to support the family. But it really highlights a limit of the innovator role, doesn't it?
It really does. And Nasmith was absolutely crucial for spreading the idea, the basic pattern, the model itself. But he seemed to struggle with building the long-term, locally embedded sustainability needed to really cross the chasm into mainstream adoption. His huge contribution was providing that proven, adoptable blueprint that others, like Jerry McCauley in the next wave, could then take and build truly lasting organizations upon. You could say Nasmith mastered the early adopter stage, but he didn't live long enough to guide the movement fully into the early majority.
Okay, let's dig a bit deeper into why Nasmith's model, even with his personal limits, managed to spread so widely. Rogers talks about 5 specific characteristics that influence how quickly any innovation gets adopted. These are the factors that kind of determine whether the city mission idea got over that initial adoption hurdle, even after Nasmith himself was gone.
Right, and while all 5 are relevant, we should probably focus on the 3 where the city mission model really shone: relative advantage, compatibility, and observability. Scoring high on these is a big reason why this movement took off when so many other early experiments just fizzled out.
Let's start with relative advantage. The question here is, was this new city mission model obviously better than what it was trying to replace those volunteer-run single-church efforts?
Oh, definitely. In pretty much every practical way, yes. We already talked about replacing unreliable volunteers with paid, dependable agents. That's a huge advantage for sustainability. But the real kicker, sociologically speaking, was homophily. That term just means how similar people are when they interact, shared background, beliefs, experiences, that kind of thing.
Okay, so how did Nasmith's model boost that homophily?
by deliberately using working class, often non-ordained, paid lay agents. The missions made sure the people delivering the help looked like, sounded like, and genuinely understood the daily struggles of the people living in those poor neighborhoods. Imagine a wealthy, educated volunteer from the local church talks to a struggling mother about getting sober. There's potentially a big cultural gap there, right? Now imagine a lay agent, maybe someone who grew up nearby, maybe even someone who'd faced addiction themselves, having that same conversation. The relational advantage, the homophily, is massive. Trust builds faster, advice lands differently. The whole interaction is just inherently more effective than the older models.
That makes sense. It makes the model not just sustainable with paid staff, but actually more powerful relationally. Okay, next up, compatibility. Did this new idea fit well with the existing values and practices of the evangelical Christians who were the ones adopting it?
It fit like a glove, really. First off, that interdenominational structure, it aligned perfectly with the cooperative spirit that was already strong in the broader evangelical revival movement happening across Britain and America at the time. Evangelicals were already used to working together on things like Bible societies or temperance campaigns. Second, the focus on the unchurched at home, the domestic mission field, it resonated deeply with the very powerful missionary impulse that already existed. Churches were already sending lots of people overseas, so redirecting some of that same energy and funding to the poor in their own cities felt like a completely natural, compatible extension of what they already believed and valued.
So they weren't swimming upstream, culturally or theologically. They were riding the current. Okay, and the third key factor, observability. How easy was it for potential adopters in other cities to actually see that this model was working so they could confidently copy it?
This is where the early city missions were incredibly smart. And it's a lesson for nonprofits today, honestly. They were meticulous about keeping records. They published detailed annual reports, often 50, even 100 pages long. And these weren't just dry financial statements. They were powerful promotional tools, packed with specific stories of lives changed alongside the financial details. They were used for fundraising and for spreading the word.
Ah, okay. So someone thinking about starting a mission in, say, Philadelphia could get their hands on the Glasgow City Missions Report from 1835, see exactly how the paid agent system worked, read stories about successful outreach and recovery, and immediately grasp the model and see its potential.
Exactly. They documented everything, the activities, the struggles, but crucially, the measurable successes. This made the whole operation, its challenges, and its triumphs incredibly visible to potential imitators around the world. The model wasn't just a theory, you could see it working, and that high observability dramatically lowered the risk for anyone thinking about starting their own mission.
That really pulls it together. Analyzing these things, the dependable paid agents, the powerful homophily, the way it fit with existing evangelical cooperation, the high visibility through reports, it reveals the blueprint. It shows that, yeah, analysis doesn't discount the spiritual aspect, but it does show the very intentional, smart, organizational design that allowed the movement to really take root and grow.
Let's maybe circle back to that analogy of flight for a second to understand a really important sociological and even legal shift that happened as Wave 1, the societies, consolidated into Wave 2, the missions.
Right. So Wave 1 societies are like those early kind of crazy flying machines, huge wingspans, weird engines, lots of different ideas trying to get off the ground. Most don't make it, but the experimentation is key.
And Wave 2, the city missions, they're like the first truly viable airplanes the model Nasmith really refined. They represent that much smaller core set of services, evangelism, crisis relief, that prove they could actually stay airborne long term.
But the sources point out something critical, and maybe often overlooked today, that happened during this consolidation phase, this loss of collective action. Specifically, the legal shift away from that broad society structure towards a much smaller board of directors.
Yeah, this is a subtle but really significant historical point, and it has big implications for how missions are governed even now. The original city mission societies, remember, were set up as these citywide central alliances. They were meant to represent the collective action of the whole Christian community in that city. We're talking structures that often had 30 or more pastors and key church leaders involved. The whole point was to ensure the mission stayed deeply connected to and representative of that broader interchurch unity.
That sounds like governing by committee, almost. Probably slow, maybe messy, but it guaranteed broad buy-in and strong ties to the churches.
Exactly. It was governance by, let's call it, comprehensive alliance. But as the legal structure of the modern nonprofit corporation started to develop, especially in the U.S., the smaller, more legally efficient board of directors became the standard way to organize. So instead of 30-plus pastors and leaders, missions started adopting boards with maybe, 7 to 12 people.
Ah, so the legal convenience of the smaller board structure gradually pushed aside the original, much broader vision of the society as this collective, citywide effort. The structure got streamlined legally, but maybe more isolated sociologically.
That's a great way to put it. That original concept of citywide collective action driven by this large representative group of leaders, it largely got lost. People favored the perceived efficiency and tighter control offered by the smaller corporate board model.
And this historical shift, that's what explains those slightly odd names we still see today, right? Why so many older missions have words like union or central in their name.
Yes. Those names are like historical markers. They point directly back to that original idea, the centralized, collective action of the city mission concept. It was about being the union of the city's churches, or the central coordinated effort for the city. It's a literal echo of that Wave 1-2 blueprint.
But if you look at a lot of missions today, even if they have union or central in the name, the actual meaning behind it seems to have faded. The governance structure might look nothing like that original large pastor-led alliance.
Right. And this connects directly to a really significant modern challenge,
Yeah.
the whole issue of board composition and the pressures of secularization. Modern nonprofit boards often, quite understandably, prioritize things like fundraising ability, business connections, influence in the community. They're often designed to bring in the who's who of successful Christian business leaders, which is vital for financial health, no doubt. But frequently, these boards lack strong, proportionate representation from pastors or people with deep theological grounding.
And the sources seem to warn that this kind of imbalance can be risky, especially when missions face pressures towards mission creep.
It really can be. Pastors and business leaders bring different but equally necessary perspectives. The business mindset is great at efficiency, scaling up, financial management. The pastoral or theological mindset is crucial for safeguarding the core mission, the spiritual identity. A board that's heavily weighted towards the business side might, sometimes unintentionally, overlook or downplay the seriousness of secularizing pressures. They might be focused on maximizing service numbers or securing funding, and in the process, quietly dilute the theological core to avoid controversy or meet funding requirements.
I see. So if the mission's name includes union, but there isn't really a functional union of churches represented on the board, that historical mandate has kind of been lost. And a business-focused board might not even see that as mission drift. They might just see it as being practical.
Exactly. They might frame it as necessary adaptation or just efficiency. The sources strongly suggest that losing that foundational commitment to being a citywide alliance, deeply connected with churches and pastors, is actually a form of mission creep. It's letting go of a core piece of historical identity. Understanding this history is a good reminder for modern missions that their governance isn't just admin, it's fundamental to who they are.
So as Nasmith's model spread and evolved, the terminology started to diverge a bit, didn't it? Outside North America, the name city missions mostly stuck around. But in the U.S., the emergence of the third wave, which we'll get into next time, led to this new term, the gospel rescue mission movement.
That's right. The particular character of the American Third Wave kind of demanded its own label. But if we zoom out and look globally today, outside of North America, the sources tend to group the vast legacy of Nasmith's initial vision into about 4 main branches or types. And this diversity really shows how adaptable the model became, but also maybe how fragmented.
Okay, what's the first branch?
First, you have the independent global city missions. These are the organizations that probably stick closest to the original Nasmith blueprint. They're largely privately funded, deliberately taking little or even no government money. This would include groups like the 18 independent missions in the UK and maybe 20 or more similar independent missions scattered across Europe, Australia, and Africa. Their identity is very much about independence and being theologically defined.
Okay, independent. What's next?
Then you have the centralized global city missions. These are local missions that are part of a bigger national organization. Think of Mission Australia or some of the German Stott missions. The key difference here is usually funding. They often receive a significant chunk, sometimes even the majority, of their funding from government sources to run large-scale social services.
Right, and that funding connection naturally leads to the third type.
The quasi-governmental stat missions. This is a very European model, often found where there's a history of state-sponsored churches, like Lutheranism in parts of Germany or Scandinavia. We're talking about maybe 40-plus missions that function almost like the social service department of the state-recognized church.
Okay.
Their funding, their mandate, it's all deeply intertwined with government policies and structures.
Okay. And finally, there's one massive, globally known organization that grew right out of this city mission soil.
Absolutely. The huge, very distinct model of the Salvation Army, founded by William and Catherine Booth back in 1865, it clearly emerged from that same broader city mission movement environment. But it quickly developed its own unique quasi-military structure and became a global force in its own right.
Now, the sources analyze this whole spectrum, looking particularly at the relationship between where the funding comes from and the typical theological stance. And this analysis seems to reveal a pretty clear pattern, especially regarding the risks each type faces.
Yeah, the pattern is quite stark when you look at the extremes. On one end, you have those privately funded city rescue missions, the fiercely independent ones. They tend to be, generally speaking, more theologically conservative. Their independence gives them total freedom doctrinally, right? But the source material points out their main risk tends to be separation and irrelevance. They risk becoming too isolated, maybe too culturally removed from the mainstream, and finding it hard to effectively connect with the modern, secular urban populations they want to serve, perhaps lacking the resources or the cultural bridge.
Okay, so that's one risk. What about the other end of the spectrum, the groups heavily reliant on state funding?
Those quasi-governmental city missions. Because they depend so much on state money, they tend over time to become more theologically liberal. And their big risk is the flip side, and maybe even more insidious, the risk of assimilation.
Let's unpack that assimilation risk a bit. How does relying on government money practically push a mission towards theological change?
Well, it creates this really strong, almost gravitational pull towards mission drift. State funding inevitably comes with strings-attached secular requirements. Things like non-discrimination policies that might conflict with hiring based on faith, strict limits on religious activities like proselytizing during funded programs, and pressure to align services purely with state-defined secular outcomes. So over time, the leadership's focus naturally shifts. It moves away from things like evangelism and discipleship, which the government doesn't pay for, towards maximizing the measurable social service outputs, which the government does pay for. Doctrinal distinctiveness can start to feel like a barrier to funding, so flexibility becomes valued. And eventually, there's a real danger the unique Christian identity gets watered down, assimilated into just being another nonprofit social service provider.
Wow. So the financially secure, state-funded mission risks, in a sense, losing its soul, while the independent, theologically conservative mission risks losing its connection or relevance.
That's essentially the tension, yes. The source material really suggests that the theological and cultural distance between these two extremes, driven largely by their funding models, is so significant now that you could almost argue they're operating as different movements entirely, even though they share that common ancestor in Nasmith's original vision. Funding, it seems, becomes a primary driver of long-term mission identity. #tag outro.
Okay, so this deep dive has really shown us David Nasmith as this tactical genius, maybe, the master of that early adopter stage. He took the vision that was already floating around and solved the immediate replication problem that had stopped earlier volunteer-based efforts in their tracks.
And the lasting success of Wave 2, the city mission model, it wasn't just random. It was driven by maximizing those innovation principles Rogers talked about. Making the model highly compatible with the existing evangelical culture, making it highly observable through those detailed reports, and giving it a powerful relative advantage by using paid lay agents who had that crucial cultural connection, that homophily with the people they were serving.
It brings us back to the value of looking at things through that innovation lens. This history is like a blueprint, isn't it? If you're trying to launch something new today, or just trying to make sure your current organization is built to last, understanding the mechanics of why Nasmith's paid interdenominational model spread, and also how easily things like governance structures can drift away from the original intent, that seems absolutely vital for long-term health.
And remember, that foundational idea, Nasmith's model, it did travel to the United States with him. But those initial 16 U.S. missions he founded, they didn't really survive his early death. The blueprint was there, though, preserved. And eventually it provided the seeds for the really powerful third wave of the movement in America.
Which leads us perfectly to our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. If David Nasmith was the master of the early adopter stage, the brilliant tactical diffuser who perfected the initial model.
And what kind of leadership, what skills are needed to actually make that terrifying jump across the chasm? Getting an idea from the enthusiastic early adopters to the cautious, practical early majority that takes something different. Nasmith gave them the vision and the initial blueprint, but how did the founder of that next wave, Jerry McAuley, provide the kind of durable, different leadership needed to make the model truly stick, truly sustainable, and really embed it successfully in the American context? That was the challenge he faced, and that's exactly what we'll be exploring in our next deep dive.